Hello and welcome back to FAD Learning. As you can see from the thumbnail, today we are going to explore one of the core components of Angular forms. Especially, we will be covering the fundamentals of template-driven form with validation from scratch and wrapping up in under an hour. Therefore, for the best learning experience, watch this video from start to finish. So you might be thinking, why use Angular forms when we can build forms with HTML tags? However, as our applications become increasingly complex, Angular forms provide a powerful tool for efficiently managing user input, data validation, and multiple form fields. The Angular team introduced forms. So, what are Angular forms? Angular Forms is a module in the Angular framework that provides a way to handle user input and validate form data. And they offer a robust and scalable way to manage forms in Angular applications. And in which scenario do we need to use Angular Forms? First, complex form validations. Angular forms are idle when we have a complex form validations. As they provide a built-in validation system, this makes it easy to validate user input and display error messages. Second, large-scale applications. Angular forms are suitable for large-scale applications as they are designed to handle complex data-driven forms. Third, Angular forms are useful for dynamic form generation, allowing us to create forms based on user input or server-side data. And last, two-way data binding. Angular forms provide two-way data binding, which means that changes to the form data are automatically reflected in the component's properties. So by using Angular forms, we can enable users to perform various data entry tasks and streamline our development process to build more robust and user-friendly applications. And Angular provides two types to building forms. First is template-driven forms. These forms are created using HTML template and suitable for simple forms. So the template-driven approach is great for simple forms. It's easy to use and we can create nice looking forms without writing any extra code. Second type of form is reactive forms. These forms are created programmatically using the form control and from group classes and are suitable for complex forms. And reactive forms are also called as model driven forms or model driven approach. In this reactive forms, the form logic is defined in the component as an object, and this form offers several benefits, including easier testing of the component. Now, let's understand what are the steps we need to follow while creating the template driven form. And the first step is import forms module. We need to import the forms module in our component, and this module provides the necessary directives for working with template driven forms. Second, we need to build our form using standard HTML form elements such as input field, checkboxes, buttons, etc. And third step is we need to convert our HTML form to a template driven form by adding the ng form directive to the form element. And this directive creates a form group instance from the form. Fourth step is to use form control. Although not explicitly required, form control is a building block of Angular forms. It represents a single form field and can be used to track the field's value, validation status, and user interactions using the ng model directive. And the last step is to submit the form. We can use the ng submit directive to handle form submission. And this directive calls the specified method when the form is submitted, allowing us to process the form data. So by following these 5 steps, we can create a fully functional template driven form in Angular. Now, let's start by exploring an example of template driven form and then we will move on to reactive forms. So I'll jump into the Visual Studio Code editor and we will continue from there. So here I have created a new component called template driven form using the CLI command. Then I have added a root for it in app.routes.ts file with the path TDF, means template driven form. And also I have added the new nav link labeled TDF to the navbar. Now inside the browser, we can see the TDF link on the navbar. And on click of this link, we can see the template driven form component rendered on the web. Now, as per the first step to work with template driven forms, first we need to import the forms module in the imports array to enable the template driven form functionality. And if you are working on a module based Angular application, then the forms module is imported in the ng module of the app.module.ts file. Alternatively, if you are working on a standalone component, you need to import the forms module inside the imports array of the respective component class file. So since we are working on an Angular 19 application which uses standalone components, so I will import the forms module inside the imports array of the template driven form component. So this is our first step. Now next step is to create an HTML template for the form using standard HTML form elements. So here I would like to use a Bootstrap form field. So I will open Bootstrap site for Bootstrap form. And here, let me copy this first div and paste this div inside our HTML file. Before that, I'll take one container class and inside this div, I'll paste a Bootstrap form field. And now I'll remove an unnecessary code. Like I don't need this for, I don't need this ID, and I don't need this small element. I'll edit this field with first name. And for first name, type must be text. And since we are building a form, I'll move this div inside form tag. We need to change the placeholder, enter first name. Now I'll duplicate this div 3 to 4 times and quickly update the field's name accordingly. The second div for last name and third div for email. For email, type should be email and the placeholder should be enter email address. And here I'll update password. And for this password, type should be password and placeholder should be enter password. I would like to add one checkbox in the same form. So here I'll change the class with form check and label should be check me out. And for checkbox, type must be checkbox. And I don't need placeholder for this field. And for this input, the class should be form check input. Control X, Control V. And at last, I'll add one submit button with class btn.btn success. The button name is submit. Now save the changes and have a look on the browser. Okay, let me add margin for all this field. Margin 2. Okay. Now save the changes and here you can see we have created a simple form. Let me add one h2 tag with text user information. And I'll add the class sendTop. So with this, we have completed the second step. Now, as per the third step, Angular automatically converts our form with form elements into a template driven form using the ng form directive. And to access the ng form properties and methods, we can export the ng form instance to a local template reference variable using the syntax hash and local template variable name, let's say user form equals to ng form. And this ng form directive creates a form group, which is a collection of form controls. And by using the template variable user form, we can access various properties and methods of ng form. So this was our third step. Now the fourth step is to bind the form controls. And one form control corresponds to one form field. So in our HTML template, we have 5 form fields like first name, last name, email, password, and checkbox with label check me out. And to connect these fields to our component, we need to add ng model directive to each one. And also the ng model directives uses the name attribute to establish this connection. Like here, if I use ng model directive without the name attribute, you will see an error message. Here, if I save the changes, you can see if ng model is used within the form tag, either the name attribute must be set or the form control must be defined as a standalone in ng model option. So this indicates that it's mandatory to include the name attribute when using ng model. So here, let me add a name attribute with value first name. Now you can see error has gone. Now I'll declare a variable with name first name. So here, first name of type string equals to empty string. And now I'll bind its value to the ng model directive using the banana in a box syntax. Ng model equals to first name. And now I'll print this first name variable below this heading using string interpolation syntax. And in the browser, as I start typing first name, FED learning, you will see the same text updated here with the first name variable. Similarly, we can do the same with the second field, last name. So here I'll declare a new variable named last name and bind it with ng model. Here I'll paste the same name attribute and ng model. And here let me update last name. And now below this first field, I'll print the last name. Save the changes and let me type something. Okay, here the last name should be like this. Now, if I type something in the last name field, and as expected, this also works like first name. But imagine in the future, if we have 20 fields, then we would have to declare 20 variables inside .ts file. So to avoid overloading our component class file with all 20 variables, we can create a separate file to store these variables. And that file is called as model. And it is good practice to keep component class files organized and focused on component logic. So for large numbers of form fields, consider creating a separate model file to store variables, which can also be reused across multiple components if needed. And in Angular, models can be created using two approaches, class and interface. And we should create a class when we need to add methods or logic to our model. In contrast, we should use an interface when we only need to define a shape or structure of our data. And both classes and interfaces can be used to represent data models in Angular. And we can create class using the command ng generate class name and create an interface using command ng generate interface name. So let me create a model by running the command ng generate interface name, I for interface, and followed by interface name, user. Enter. And this will generate a new file called user.interface.ts in the current directory containing the basic structure of an interface like this. Export interface name user. And if you want to learn more about TypeScript interfaces, kindly check out my interface video from the TypeScript tutorial. Now, inside this user interface, we can declare the properties required for our form. So let's add the 5 properties corresponding to these 5 form fields, like first name of type string. And additionally, we can define extra properties as optional by using the question mark. By doing so, we allow the forms to have some or all of those optional properties, making the interface more flexible. Okay, so this is how I have added 5 properties for the 5 fields of user information form. So here we are exporting the user interface, which means it allows us to import and reuse it whenever we need this model in our application. Now, inside .ts file, instead of these two properties, let's declare a new object called user object and assign it the type user. And let's initialize it as an empty object to store the user information. And make sure we have to import the path of this user interface. Now we have all the properties of user interface in user object. So let's bind each property to user object in the template file using the ngModel directive. So here, instead of first name, now I'll bind this first name with user object dot first name because we have declared this property inside user interface. So similarly, I'll update the last name user object dot last name, and I'll copy this name attribute and ngModel, and I'll paste this for all three form fields. This is for email. The value of ngModel will be user object dot email. This name should be pass, and the ngModel value user object dot pass. And this is check user object dot check. Okay, so this is how I have binded all the properties of user interface using user object. But here, if you try to assign a value to a property that is not defined in the user interface, then TypeScript will raise an error. For example, here I am trying to access the name property instead of first name. So this will result an error saying property name does not exist on type user. It means this name property does not exist on type user means inside user interface. Okay, so let me update this with first name. Okay, so with this we have completed our fourth step. Now our template is ready except for the final piece. That is our fifth step, submitting data to the component. And for this, we need to use the ngSubmit event to submit the form data to the component class. Let's use the event binding to bind the ngSubmit event to the onSubmit method in the component class. So inside parenthesis, we need to write ngSubmit equals to onSubmit. And we need to pass the local template variable user form to the onSubmit method. And this variable references the ngForm directive, allowing us to access and extract data from the form fields within our component class. Now, when the user click on the submit button, the ngSubmit event will be triggered. So the final step is to receive the form data in our component. And to do this, we will create an onSubmit method within our component class file. And this method receives the ngForm directive reference, which we have named user form of type ngForm. And to verify the submitted data, we can log the form's value to the console using console.log. So here I'll write user form.value. Now save the changes and open the browser and fill out the form. First name, I'll write FED, last name, learning, email, fedlearning24@gmail.com, and password 1234. And then I'll click on this checkbox. And now first let me open the developer console to see the output. And now I'll click on the submit button, and here we can see the field values inside console: email, first name, check, last name, and password. So with this, we have successfully created a template driven form using all the 5 steps. And also we have received the form data in our component. So let's review all 5 steps quickly. In Angular template driven forms, first we have imported forms module into the imports array of the template driven form component. Second, we have created an HTML form. And third, Angular has detected the form tag, and we have converted that form into the Angular forms using the ngForm directive. Fourth, we have added the ngModel directive with name attribute to each form element. And finally, we have bound the submit event via event binding. Okay. Now we have gained access to the ngForm instance through the local template variable user form, and we can leverage its various properties and methods to determine the current state of the form. For example, here I'll use pre-tag. Inside that, I'll write some properties or methods like value, and inside double curly brackets, I'll bind the value of user form dot value, and here I'll use JSON pipe. In order to use JSON pipe, first we need to import it inside imports array JSON pipe. Similarly, I'll add few more properties here like valid, username dot valid. This is for invalid. And third is for touched. Fifth is for untouched. This is for submitted. So here I have added 6 properties that determine the current state of the form. Let's understand all these properties with output. Property first name does not exist. Okay. Let me delete these 2 lines and now save the changes. And here you can see the output of value property is empty object because we need to fill the values inside the form. So here let me fill fed. You can see inside value we can see the first name property. Similarly, if I type last name, that is learning, the last name property is added inside this value object. Same for email, password, and checkbox. Okay, now you can see the value object with all 5 properties of user information form. Now let me refresh the page and let's understand the second property, that is valid. And this valid returns true if the form is valid, otherwise returns false. And in our current scenario, none of the form fields are marked as required. So as a result, the form is considered valid even when no fields are filled in. This means we can submit the form without entering any value. And if I mark any field as required, like here, if I add this first name field as required and save the changes, now you can see the valid property returns false. And once I fill the first name, then it becomes true because we have filled all mandatory fields. Now the form is valid and we can submit the form. Now let's understand the third property, that is invalid. And this property returns true if the form is invalid, otherwise return false. In this case, our form is invalid because this first name is required field. Once I fill this field, the invalid property becomes false. Here you can see. So hope you understand the difference between valid and invalid property. Next property is touched. This property returns true if the user has interacted or touched with at least one form field. So right now this is returning false, but once I touch to any field, it becomes true. Here you can see. Similarly, untouched returns true if the user has not interacted or untouched with any form fields. And if I touched or interact with any form field, it becomes false, like this. Now last property is submitted. It returns true if the form has been submitted, otherwise return false. If I fill the required field and click on submit button, it becomes true. Here you can see. Okay, so this is how we have understood various properties and methods to determine the current state of the form. Now, let me comment out these property and let's understand how to set the values in template-driven forms. Under this, we will learn how to set default or initial values to form controls. Also, we will understand how to set values dynamically, and after that, we will see how to reset form values. Okay, so there are 2 ways we can set the value of the form elements. First is two-way data binding, and second is using template reference variable. And we have already explored setting values using two-way data binding with the ng model directive. Now let's move on to the second approach, that is setting values using the template reference variable. So let's start using the initial or default value. And as we all know, once our component is initialized, the ngOnInit lifecycle hook will get called. So we can set the default value to the user object as per the user model in the ngOnInit method. So let me implement ngOnInit first, and then we need to define the ngOnInit method inside class. Now inside this ngOnInit method, I'll print the user object with initial value. So here inside this object, I'll pass the initial value to all these properties. First name Rahul, last name Verma, email rahul@gmail.com, password 12345, and it take true. Now save the changes and let's have a look at the browser. And as you can see here, the form has rendered on the browser with default values. Okay, so this is how we can set initial or default value inside ngOnInit lifecycle hook. But we have a user form reference variable, which is an instance of a ng form. So once we have the reference, we can use the set value method of the ng form to set the initial value. And to do this, I'll first create a new button in the HTML file with name set value. Warning. And here I'll add a click event and I'll assign a function called set values and pass the user form reference variable. And now I'll define the same function inside the TS file. Here also I'll pass user form of type ng form. And inside this set values method, we will declare a new object using let keyword, let obj equals to, I'll assign the same values inside this obj object. And for now, let's comment out this user object in the ngOnInit method. And next, we will pass this new obj object to the set value method. Like here, user form dot set value, and inside round bracket, I'll pass the obj object. Now save the changes and let's refresh the browser. Okay, user form does not exist. User form. Okay, here let me correct the spelling. User form, and here we should be capital. Set values, and now save the changes and let's refresh the page. And here you can see the form is empty because we have commented out the code in the ngOnInit method. And to set the form values dynamically, we need to click the set values button, and now we can see the form with values. Let me refresh the page again, and again I'll click on set values button, and as expected we can see the form values. Okay, so this is how we have successfully set the values individually using the set value methods of each form control. But what if we want to set only these three properties instead of all five properties? Like here, if I comment out these two properties from this object, and now let me open developer tool again, clear the console, and once I click on this set value button, it will throw an error saying must supply a value of form field with name pass. And if I uncomment this pass, we can see the same message for each check property like this. Okay, which means that with the set value method, we must set all properties even if we don't need them. And to set only the required properties, we can use the patch value method. So let's try this out quickly. For patch value, I'll create another button named patch value with corresponding method called patch value. And I'll change the button color to primary. Next, I'll define this patch value method inside TS file. Below this, I'll pass same user form of type ng form. And inside this patch value method, I'll copy paste this same object, but this time I'll not set the last two properties. Here I'll uncomment this eCheck property, and inside this patch value property, now we have set only three properties: first name, last name, and email property. Now here, after this object, I'll use the control property of ngForm, which returns a reference to the top level form group. And then I'll utilize the patch value method to update only the first name, last name, and value field. Inside this patch value, I'll write obj. Now let's check the result in the browser. If I click on set values button, it sets all form fields value. Now I'll refresh the page, and this time I'll click on patch values button. And as you can see, it sets only the required fields value, that is first name, last name, and email. And the password field is empty and checkbox is unchecked, because we have set only three properties inside this patch value method. So this method demonstrates how to use the patch value method to update only a few fields at any time. So what is the key difference between the set value and patch value methods? The set value method sets a new value of an individual control, and it's strictly following the form group structure and replacing the entire control value. In contrast, the patch value method replaces only the properties defined in the object that have changed in the form model, allowing for more targeted updates. Now last, let's understand how to reset the form to its initial empty state using the reset or reset form method of the ngForm. So let's create a new button for reset with corresponding function name reset value. And I'll change the button class to secondary. Now next, let's define the reset values function inside the class file with user form of type ngForm. Now inside this reset values function, we can use either the reset method or we can use reset form method to reset the form. Let me comment out one method and let's test in the browser. First, let's populate the form field values by clicking either the set values or patch values button, and then we can reset the form. So let me click on set values, and then to reset the form, we can simply click the reset button. Here we can see our form is empty. Now let's comment out this reset method and uncomment this reset form method. And this time I'll populate the form fields value using patch value button, and then in order to reset the form, I'll click on reset button. Okay, so it means with the help of these two methods, we can reset the entire form. And these two methods not only clear the form's value, but also reset the form status, including its dirty, valid, cached states. Okay, so far we have explored how to create template driven form. Then we have seen how to set the default values using set value and patch value methods. And last, we have seen how to reset the entire form. Next, we will bind on our existing template driven form by adding validation rules to enhance its functionality. So let's start. We have created a simple user form. So this is our template file and this is our class file for the user information form. Now let's try to validate this form using built-in validators. So there are 5 built-in validators in template-driven forms. First is required. It ensures the form control has a value, and if the control is empty, the form will be invalid. Next is min length. It ensures the form control value meets the minimum length, and if the value is shorter than the specified length, then the form will be considered invalid. On the other hand, we have the max length validator. This validator ensures the form control value does not exceed the maximum length, and if the value is longer than the specified length, the form will be invalid. Next built-in validator is pattern. It ensures the form control value matches the specified pattern, and the pattern is defined using a regular expression. If the value does not match the pattern, the form will be considered invalid. And the last validator is email. It ensures the form control value is a valid email address, and if the value is not a valid email address, the form will be invalid. So these built-in validators greatly simplify the process of form validation in template-driven forms. Now, let's open Visual Studio Code Editor and see how it works in practice. But before we dive deeper into built-in validators, let's check the form status by printing the valid property, like user form.valid. Now open the browser and let me navigate to template-driven form component. And here you can see, as a result, the valid property returns false, indicating that the form is invalid due to the required first name field not being filled. Here you can see we have marked required for this first name field. So ideally, the form should not be submitted in an invalid state. However, let me open developer tool, and once I click on this submit button, I am getting the values of our user form. It means I can still submit the form even though it's invalid. And this nullifies the purpose of having validators if required fields can be bypassed. So in this scenario, what we need to do is disable this submit button if our form is not valid, so that the user cannot click on the submit button until they have filled in all the required fields, right? So let's do this now. And we know that the form group has valid and invalid properties. The valid property returns true if the form is valid, whereas the invalid property returns true if the form is invalid. So let's use this property to set the disabled attribute of the submit button. And to do this, we have to write disabled attribute property binding equals to, here we can either use not operator with the valid property like user form dot valid, or we can directly use the invalid property without not operator, like this. Both approaches achieve the same result. Let me comment out this line number 33 and save the changes. Go back to browser, and as you can see here, the submit button is disabled. This is because the user form is invalid due to the required first name field being empty. Now keep an eye on the submit button. As soon as I fill in the required first name field, the submit button becomes active. Here you can see. And if I reset the first name field, the submit button is disabled again. And refilling the required value re-enables the submit button. So this confirms that our disable submit button functionality is working as expected. Now let's start working with built-in validators. And as discussed earlier, the first built-in validator is required validator. This validator returns true only if the form control has a non-empty value. So let's add this validator to first three fields. And to use this validator, simply add the required attribute to the form control, which refers to the form field value. So here we have already added a required attribute to the first name field. Similarly, we will add it to the next two fields for last name and email. Okay. And I'll comment out the set values and reset buttons for now, but I'll keep patch values button enabled because as we implemented earlier, clicking this button will populate the three fields like first name, last name, and email. So this allows me to bypass manual entries for these three required fields, and I can easily test the form's validation. So now let's observe the submit button's behavior. Initially it's disabled, but as soon as all required fields are filled, the submit buttons becomes enabled. So let me click on this patch value button, and as you can see, the submit button becomes enabled, and this is the expected behavior for any form. So let's do this one more time. I'll refresh the page and this time manually enter the values. Here, let me fill first name, and as you can see, filling in just a first name field doesn't enable the submit button because we have marked three fields as required, and the submit button is enabled only after all three required fields are filled. So let me fill remaining two fields as well. And now that all three fields are filled, and here you can see the valid property becomes true and that is why the submit button is enabled. Okay, so this illustrates how the required validator works, ensuring that user provide essential information before submitting the form. Now let's move forward with the second validator, which is mean length. And the mean length validator specifies a minimum character requirement for a form controls value. And to use this, we simply add the mean length attribute to the input field and assign it a numeric value. For example, I'll assign 5. So this ensures that the input field such as first name field must contain at least the specified number of characters. So in this case, 5 characters. If the changes, and let's click the patch value button to populate the required fields. And next I'll update the first name field, and notice the submit button. When I enter the name like Bob, which contains only 3 characters, the submit button remains disabled. Also, you can see this valid property returns false due to the mean length validator, which requires at least 5 characters in this field. But as soon as I enter 5 or more characters, the form becomes valid and the submit button is enabled. So the mean length validator verifies that the length of the input value is at least the specified minimum number of characters, and blocking form submission until this requirement is satisfied. Now let's use the max length validator, which works exactly opposite to this mean length validator, which means that with the max length validator, the input value does not exceed a specified maximum number of characters as defined in the attributes value. So I will apply the max length validator to the second field, that is last name, and the syntax is similar to mean length. Simply add the max length attribute and assign it a numeric value. I'll assign same value 5. Now again let's populate the first 3 fields by clicking the patch value button. And in the second field, if I try to enter more than 5 fields like X, Y, Z or anything, the max length validator will prevent me from doing so. In the second field, I cannot enter more than 5 characters. So this demonstrates the key difference between mean length and max length validators. Mean length needs at least 5 characters, while max length allows only 5 characters or less. Now let's understand the fourth type of validator, which is pattern. This pattern validator requires that the control value must match the regex pattern provided in the attribute. For example, in this second field, let me increase the max length to 15, and the pattern is up arrow inside square bracket small a to z and capital A to capital Z plus dollar symbol. So this pattern ensures that the only letters are allowed, even spaces are not allowed. So let's test this in browser. Let me click on patch value button to fill first 3 required fields. And in the second field, if I enter any text less than 15 character, the form is valid. However, if I enter or type numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, or if I add a space or special character like hash, dollar, at the rate, etc., the form becomes invalid due to the pattern validator, as well as our submit button is also disabled. It means we can enter only letters like from A to Z. Okay. So this is how we can utilize pattern validator to add a specific pattern, thus restricting user inputs and preventing form submission. So we have seen required validator, mean length, max length, and pattern validator. Now, last validator is email validator. I'll apply this to email field. And this email validator checks that the entered value is valid email address, and it is typically used for email fields. Let's first test the email field without the email validator. If I remove this at the rate from this email address, as you can see, I can submit the form even if I enter an email ID without the at the rate symbol, because our form is still valid. But adding the email validator, let me save these changes. Email validator restricts form submission. Now, if I remove the at the rate symbol from an same email address, the submit button becomes disabled. If I try to enter the email address here, abc@gmail.com. So as you can see here, it only becomes enabled when I enter a valid email format, such as any name @ and then gmail.com or any other correct format. It means this email validator ensures that user enter a valid and properly formatted email address, preventing incorrect or invalid email submissions. Okay. So in this way, Angular built-in form validators can be utilized. But as a developer, we are aware of the validators applied to each field. However, from the user's point of view, it's essential to display short or meaningful error messages that guide them in understanding and correcting their mistakes. So now let's understand how to add effective error messages. And as we know, Angular automatically creates a form control instance for each form field that has the ng model directive applied. And we have already accessed properties such as value, valid, invalid, touched, and more of the user form using the template reference variable. In the same way, we can access the same properties of the form control by creating a new local variable for each form control. So let's get access to the form control instance by assigning the ng model to a local variable. And the syntax is hash local variable name. For first name, I'll use fname variable equals to ng model. This is how we can create a local variable for this form control. And by doing this, the variable fname holds a reference to the first name form control. Let's access the properties of form control. Let me copy the first four properties from here. I'll paste this below the first name field. Let me comment out this line number 3. And let me update this user form with fname. I don't need this JSON. Let me delete this JSON from imports array as well. And now, when I enter a value in the first name field, you just observe how the properties change. Yeah. The value property returns the entered value. The valid property returns true. The invalid property returns false. And the touched property returns true. So with the help of local variable of this form control, we can access these properties: value, valid, invalid, and touched. And this indicates that we have successfully gained access to the first name field properties, allowing us to track its state in real time. Now, let's make use of these properties to display the respective error messages. For that, we need to write the if condition. And you can use either the *ng if directive by importing the common module in the imports array, or you can use built-in control flow syntax using @if block. Since I am working on an Angular 19 application, I'll use the @if block syntax. And for this, I don't need to import any module in the imports array. So for this form control, we have added two built-in validators, mean length and required. So I wish to render two different messages conditionally. So I'll write the if syntax with the condition fname dot errors dot required. And we need to wrap this required inside square bracket in single quotes. Okay, so this first name refers to the form control instance for the first name field. After that, I have added dot errors for safely navigates to the errors property, avoiding null or undefined errors. And then I have written dot required. This checks if the errors object has a required property. And if this condition is met, I'll display a short error message. So for this, I'll use small tag with class text danger to show the error message in red. And the error message is first name is required. Okay. So similarly, I'll add another condition for mean length. So here I'll replace this required with mean length, and the message for mean length is the minimum length of the first name should be 5. Okay, save the changes. And let's test these messages in the browser. And on page load, the message first name is required is displayed. However, as soon as I start typing, the error message changes to the minimum length of the first name should be 5. And once I meet the minimum length requirement, no error message is displayed because the field becomes valid. So this indicates that on page load, the required validator is triggered, and once I start typing, the mean length validator is triggered. But we don't want the application to display errors when the form first loads. Instead, errors should only appear after the user interacts with the field. And that is where the dirty and touched property come into play. A form control is considered dirty when the user manually changes its value, whereas a form control is considered touched when the user clicks or away from it. So let's try these two properties as well. So before this first if condition, let me add one more if block with condition fname.dirty or fname.touched. And now I'll move these two if block inside this if block. Okay. Now let's retest the functionality. And this time, no error message is displayed on page load. But when I touch the first name and leave the field empty, the required validator is triggered with message first name is required. And when I enter less than 5 characters, the mean length validator is triggered with message the minimum length of the first name should be 5. And when I enter 5 or more than 5 characters, no error message is displayed because this time our field becomes valid. Okay, so similarly, let's add error messages for the remaining two fields. Now I'll comment out these properties. And for last name field, let's create a local template variable hash lname equals to ng model. After that, I'll copy the same if block structure from here and I'll paste it below this last name input field. Now I'll update the local variable with fname. And also make sure to update the error message to reference last name. So this is for last name. And for this last name field, I'll add error message to the pattern validator. The error message for pattern validator is last name does not match the required pattern. Okay, so this is for second field, that is last name. Also, I'll add the similar error message to the third field, that is email. So here, let me create local variable with hash symbol email ID equals to ng model. And let me update this lname with email ID. One error message for required. Email address is required. And second error message for email validator. And the message for email validator is please enter a valid email address. Now save the changes and let's test the forms validation. Now when I focus on a field and then click away without entering any text. As you can see, the required validator is triggered and displaying the respective error message. And for the first name field, entering less than 5 characters triggers the min length validator and showing an respective error message. Next, the last name field has a pattern validator. And when I try to enter numbers or special characters, I receive the error message, last name does not match the required pattern. It means the pattern validator is triggered. Okay. Similarly, email field has an email validator. If I enter an invalid email address, I get the error message, please enter a valid email address due to email validator is triggered. So let me type the proper email address. And with this, our form becomes valid. And now we can submit the form. Okay. So with this, we have learned how to display error messages using built-in validators in Angular forms. Now last, let's understand how to disable all the browser's built-in form validation. And we can disable the browser validation by adding the no validate attribute on the form element. Like in HTML, the no validate attribute is used to disable the browser's built-in form validation. So when this attribute is added to a form element, the browser will not perform any validation on the form fields, even if they have attributes like required, min length, max length, pattern, etc. So, if the no validation attribute is used to disable the browser's built-in form validation, then why would we want to do that? Actually, this attribute is useful in specific scenarios such as custom validation. When we want to perform custom validation on the form fields using JavaScript, we can use the no validate attribute to disable the browser's built-in validation. Second, no validate attribute useful for server-side validation. In some cases, we may prefer server-side validation over client-side validation. So by adding the no validate attribute, we can bypass the browser's built-in validation and rely exclusively on server-side validation. So this approach is particularly useful for complex validation rules or when integrating with existing server-side validation frameworks. And third scenario is progressive enhancement. If older browsers doesn't support HTML5 form validation and we are still using HTML5 validation attributes without no validate, it can prevent form submission. So in this case, adding the no validate attribute can help by disabling HTML5 validation and allowing the form to submit. So the disabling browser validations can be bad for users because they won't get instant feedback when they fill out a form incorrectly. So only use the no validate attribute when it's really necessary. Now, moving on from the practical implementation, and let's discuss the advantages of template driven forms. Template driven forms offer several advantages, including easy to use. Template driven forms require minimal setup and configuration, making them user friendly to work with. Second advantage is rapid prototyping. Template driven forms enable quick creation and testing of a forms, accelerating the development process. Next advantage is simple validation. It provides straightforward validation using HTML5 attributes, simplifying error handling. Next, less code required. It minimizes the need for extensive coding, reducing development time and effort. Next advantage is easy data binding. Template driven forms simplify data binding, automatically connecting from controls to data models. And last advantage is fast development. Template driven forms streamline the development process, enabling developers to quickly bind and develop forms. So these advantages make template driven forms a popular choice for building simple to medium complexity form in Angular application. Now, on the other hand, template driven forms also have some drawbacks, including limited control, restricts ability to customize form behavior. Next, difficult debugging makes it hard to identify and fix form related issues. Next, limited reusability. Form components are not easily reusable across applications. Next, tight coupling. Form logic is tightly coupled with template, making changes difficult. Next disadvantage is not suitable for complex forms. Struggles to handle complex form logic and validation. And last disadvantage is limited unit testing capability. Makes it challenging to write unit tests for form related code. So these disadvantages highlight the limitations of template driven forms, particularly when dealing with complex forms or applications that require more control and flexibility. So the conclusion is that template driven forms are a convenient and easy to use way to handle user input and validate form data in Angular. However, they may not be suitable for complex forms that requires more control over form validation and submission. For such complex forms, reactive forms are a better choice. And I'll cover reactive forms in a separate video exploring their features and functionality in depth. So before we conclude, let's review what we have learned about template based forms. First, we have covered the basics of Angular forms, including when to use them. and then explored the two main types of forms, template driven and reactive forms. We have also walked through the step by step process of creating a template driven form, including how to set default values using set value and patch value methods. Additionally, we have learned how to reset the form. After that, we have used built in validators to ensure user input is correct and also displayed respective error messages. Furthermore, we have discussed the importance of the no validate attribute. And finally, we have covered the advantages and disadvantages of template driven forms, considering factors such as simplicity, flexibility, and capability. So I hope this video has helped you to grasp the fundamentals of template driven forms in Angular. And if you found it helpful, kindly show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to FAD Learning for more informative content. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye bye.